Good morning, members of the public. We welcome you to our 79th public meeting. My name is Margaret Hinkle. I chair the Post Commission. Let me take a roll call of the other commissioners in attendance, please. Commissioner Baker?
Morning, present.
Commissioner Bluestone?
Good morning, present.
Commissioner Calderon?
Good morning, here.
Good morning. Commissioner Crispin?
Good morning, present.
Commissioner Hall?
Good morning, present.
Commissioner Kazarosian?
Good morning, present.
Commissioner Luma?
Good morning, present.
And Commissioner Talley.
Morning, present.
And we obviously have a quorum. Every commissioner is present. Next, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of our July 16th, 2026 meeting. Is there such a motion?
Yes, so moved.
I'll second.
Sorry, who seconded it?
I did, Calderon.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And let me take a roll call vote on that, please. Commissioner Baker?
Yes.
Commissioner Calderon?
Yes.
Commissioner Crispin?
Yes.
Commissioner Hall?
Yes.
Commissioner Luma?
Yes.
Commissioner Talley? Commissioner Talley, did you approve the minutes?
Oh, I said yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
So it's okay.
They're unanimously approved. Next, we'll move on to the Executive Director report. Enrique, please.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I will share my screen in a moment to walk you through a few slides as part of my report. So bear with me as I do this. And everybody see the presentation? Yeah. So again, good morning. For those of you in attendance who want to reach us, you may be able, you may do so using any of the resources on the screen. We accept and very much appreciate any written comments that come our way. And you can do that by submitting an email to post-comment@mas.gov. This morning, I will be providing a summary of the items in the screen. They are mostly focused around the use of force model policy and related topics. I will start by talking about the self-assessment form, which we will be deploying soon, and agencies will be required to submit to post. This will be followed by an overview of the related topic, which is the agency use of force reporting form, and will be followed by the use of force reports to post that the regulations prescribe. Finally, I will close with a brief administrative update. Our CFAO, Eric Ravello-Pradas, will come back in September at the next meeting to give you an end-of-year fiscal report, like he does every September. So let me just give me a minute. So both the use of force regulations and the model policy that was recently adopted by the Commission and the NPPC state that agencies are required to have use of force policies that are consistent with the model use of force policy. We know that every agency practically has a use of force policy. What we're looking for is consistency with the model policy. To effectuate and verify this requirement, we will be sending a self-assessment form or the model policy self-assessment form, again, to ascertain consistency. This form will include an area in the response to let agencies broadly identify any part of the policy or any aspect of the model policy that may not apply to their agencies. And of course, the best example that we can think of is departments that have unarmed officers, like some of the colleges. There's, of course, a section on firearms that For those agencies, the model policy would not apply. Again, this self-assessment is not to be a word-for-word comparison. We have consistently messaged that the word consistency is not to be a verbatim assessment. As part of this self-assessment, we are also inquiring about agency participation. Agencies participate in the Massachusetts Police Accreditation Committee, or otherwise known as MPAC, or the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, also known as CALIA. In addition, we are inquiring if any authority in the past has used corrective action or regarding the topic of use of force on any agency. We expect this to be a very small, if any, group of agencies, but we want to ascertain that possibility. And as I mentioned earlier, the intention is to send these self-assessment form to agencies very soon, probably at the beginning of September, with a deadline for September 30th. I will move on to the second part of the use of force topic. Included in the packet is something we call, or the regulations that the model policy calls, the agency use of force reporting form. And by way of background, post staff researched, and the MPTC researched forms that are currently being used by different agencies in Massachusetts, and also looked at forms in other jurisdictions outside of the state. Notably, we consider the use of force form that the Mass Chiefs Association have endorsed, and we understand multiple agencies in Massachusetts use. And it is fair to say that the draft agency reporting form, or use of force reporting form, is mostly modeled after the MACOPA form, the Mass Chiefs Association. We looked at other forms like the one used in Connecticut, where the statute also requires a use of force reporting to the state. And we looked at Springfield, the state police, and a few other municipal police forms, and believe that what we've come up with is a good, easy to attain form. It bears mentioning, for example, that the form in Springfield is very detailed, given that their recent history and consent decree with the DOJ, which I should note, that consent decree was closed earlier this year, but it was notably around the notion of use of force and the use of force reporting. So that was an important form for us to look at. I do want to emphasize the second bullet in this slide. What may be more important to talk about in the context of this proposed form is what is not in the form. And in the discussions with the MPTC, we are proposing to eliminate the use of certain fields and checkboxes that begin to describe the events of a particular incident that they may be describing. And the reason to do that is to, in favor of having officers describe those events in the narrative field. For example, MACOPA, the chief's form, includes a section on the officer perception of the events. It also includes a section on the escalation tactics used. And currently they check off one or more of those checkboxes, which again begins to be how they will later write the report. Again, the reason behind eliminating those checkboxes is to guide or really incentivize the officer to write their version of events in the description of the report, rather than bias them, if you will, or anchor them to select an option where other important details perhaps are later omitted. Again, I mentioned A good example of these, the chief's form includes, I think, 9 de-escalation tactics as checkboxes. And again, the idea is to let officers, describe what they did towards de-escalation in the narrative. Now, the use of force form, like the model policy, is envisioned to be deployed as the minimum information to be collected by agencies. Agencies might still decide to keep additional detail, including, frankly, the checkboxes. But again, our approach is to stipulate the floor for compliance, and we are messaging that moving away from this continuum of force, which is the recent trend, we are eliminating those checkboxes. Now, we have reached out for additional feedback from MACOPA, and we will ascertain feedback and guidance from the NPTC as well before we bring back the form to you, commissioners, for your approval and eventual deployment. So on to the last topic of the use of force. This slide represents, this and the next slide, represents the instances in which force is required to be reported to post. The first category here, officer involved injury or death, comes directly from the statute. It includes what would be intuitive to many, the discharge of use of a weapon, actually or approximately causes injury or death to another. However, the definition in the statute also includes instances in which an officer engages in a physical altercation with a person who sustains serious bodily injury or requests or receives medical care as a result. This is a particular section in the law where I believe there may be some underreporting. I believe there has been a lot of emphasis on reporting complaints and disciplinary matters to post for good reason. The statute talks quite a bit about that. That was a new process, from our inception. Previous communications and questions from agencies really have centered and focused around disciplinary matters or complaints, and what is credible, what is a minor matter, etc. But when it comes to this particular aspect of use of force, even when force was warranted, I believe we may not be getting all these reports. I will mention something else on actual shooting, which I should say are not very common. This is also something that is not always reported to us. We have the obligation to report that as part of our annual report for all officer-involved shootings and incidents that resulted in serious bodily injury or death. And we track from our news stories that we follow, we track all of those events. And when we come to the annual report to make our report to the legislature, we reconcile with the fact that not always those incidents are reported to us. Agencies tend to think first of reporting such an incident to the district attorney or the state police, where deadly force was used, to investigate and confirm that the incident was legitimate, etc. But they don't always, again, report that to us. We will make sure that as part of these use of force reporting form, an emphasis that those be reported each time they happen. So the proposed changes to 555 CMR1, which again the Commission has considered as a draft, and we will be coming back in the very near future to ask for a vote to initiate to commence the promulgation process. includes a section that clarifies notices reportable by agencies. One of those such incidents or notices that are required to be reported to post include instances related to use of force. We envision a new section in the statute, in the portal for these reportable notices, so that agencies know to go to the portal, where they typically go to submit complaints to us, but there will now be these additional, clear other examples or instances, notably use of force, that where they can also report certain things to us. Currently, people are sending emails or using the portal for a complaint where it really doesn't fit a complaint in these instances of use of force. And again, we will undertake an effort to make that a lot more clear, along with this effort of the form that will be consistent for everyone. When it comes to those reports on use of force, we will collect some basic information on the incident, the officer involved, the agency, relevant dates. Again, it's meant to be just basic information so that they can enter and upload any additional attachments if necessary. And we plan on collecting whether the event is or will be reviewed by an outside authority. And of course, ascertain if there is an internal affairs case that has or will be opened. I'm sorry. I clicked. Again, we anticipate that agencies will be able to upload, like they currently do in the portal, upload additional information as may be relevant, and we are in the process of making those updates on our portal. I will move on to the next part of my report. I typically mention here the types of activities we have had regarding outreach, engagement, and so on, especially with outside parties. But I do want to start by mentioning our semi-annual staff meeting back in July 22nd. We had a meeting with the main theme of leveraging existing technology, given what we see as the continued increase in workload, and the reality that our rate of growth when it comes to the budget is decelerating. So I envision additional enhancements to technology, to workflows, just like I said a moment ago about in our portal, and that will be a big emphasis of this next fiscal year. Now on July 28th, our agency hosted a legal seminar on effective appellate advocacy for legal interns from various Massachusetts agencies, as well, of course, as members of our own staff and our own interns. With their substantial experience in federal and state appellate practice, attorneys Veronica Lightfoot, Randy Ravitz, and Ben Robbins of our legal division gave great presentations and answered questions from those in attendance. I should mention that, like Post, other state agencies do these kinds of presentations for the benefits of interns. They're encouraged to attend. Our own interns get to attend, and this, of course, enhances their experience and contributes to their learning, and of course, also our own learning. Finally, we recently met with a few chiefs from the hospital law enforcement departments, given their questions of applicability of the use of force model policy to those security individuals that are not sworn. In other words, do not have the warrant to be a state police officer, also known as an SSPO, and therefore do not carry police powers or weapons. Our answer will be that no, they will not need to be certified by Post just by virtue of compliance with the model use of force policy, but important to ascertain what they do and the process that they undertake in certain instances. Incidentally, we will point to the regulations that the Commission will Later in this agenda, we'll consider a document that clarifies the construction of scope that has been in effect, and Randy will be doing that presentation later on. Finally, I want to give a couple of staff updates. Since our last commission meeting, effective this week, Ivy Drew is the senior intake coordinator. She has been promoted. Ivy has been covering on an interim basis since Laura Martin went on maternity leave. Laura asked for and came back to reduced hours, and Ivy will now be taking that coordinator supervisor position going forward. She will manage and oversee progress and workload in this busy area where we not only manage complaints submitted to us, but we review and track all the reports from agencies. Importantly, we anticipate the need to look at workflows to realize efficiencies, again, with the ongoing use of technology. Congratulations again, by the way, Ivy. I will also mention that two great employees who have done great work for us from the early days of Post are moving on from their position. This is Al, our paralegal and hearings administrator, left us effective July 22nd to concentrate on finishing law school in Connecticut, where she lives. We know she will be a great lawyer one day soon, and we look forward to staying in touch. Similarly, Tim Quinn, in the Division of Standards, a compliance agent, is moving on to work at the investigations department of a large technology company. Tim was one of our first compliance agents who, along with JP, John Polillo, helped us craft an approach to investigations, preliminary inquiries, and internal processes within the Division of Standards. And we wish Tim a lot of luck. We thank him for the great work he did for us. And we have already posted a position for compliance agent and have seen great interest. So we're looking forward to that process as well. Finally, big congratulations to Annie Lee on her acceptance to the Boston Bar Association's Public Interest Leadership Program. I will quote from Randy's email to the staff a few days ago when he noticed this accomplishment. This year-long program designed to provide intensive leadership and professional development training to rising stars in the Boston legal community is what this program is. We know, and it's an opportunity for individuals like Annie, who are highly motivated to connect with other leaders in the Boston's public and private sectors to gain critical skills and tools needed to grow as an effective leader and voice in the community. We are all, of course, well acquainted with Annie's talent and motivation and look forward to seeing her continue to achieve great things. Again, congratulations to Annie. With that, let me just mention that I will pause my report here. I will take any questions if well, let me stop sharing my screen, and here we go. And ask if commissioners have any questions or comments that I can address. I'll be happy to.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Eddie, please. Commissioner Crispin?
Yes, just quick question. In terms of the use of force that agencies will be loading, is there thoughts of creating a uniform form, if you will, that everybody will submit as opposed to their individual agency forms?
Well, what we are saying with this idea to have well, there's two things. What has to be reported to Post will definitely be uniform. They have to fill out certain fields that are structured data. They can select drop-down menu, enter fields, etc. That's meant to be a little bit of data, but that's again structured, and that will definitely be uniform. Then agencies are also required to use within their own agency the use of force reporting form. This is what I meant to say. We're putting out there as a model, as a floor. Agencies may use, at a minimum, have to use the data incorporated in that form. Now, we understand that there's agencies that have a lot of maybe some technology tools where changing would be, resource intensive, which is why our approach is that at a minimum it needs to cover these fields. So to answer directly your question, Commissioner Crispin, is that we will not be forcing a particular form to be uniform across agencies. We're saying it has to be the floor or the minimum information that they're required to track. And in some instances, those cases that get reported to us, they may upload that form electronically.
Thank you. Any other questions? Enrique, thank you very much for your report. Let me move on now to the Division of Standards semi-annual report and turn to Matt Landry, please.
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm just going to take a moment to put my slides up. All right. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. So the Division of Standards is continuing to work at a very high pace overall. I'm just going to provide you a brief update as to our current caseload. So first, you can see that for the reporting period of March 1st to July 31st, our team has received and reviewed a total of 467 complaints that have been submitted by members of the public. This doesn't include a number of complaints that were duplicates or that were screened out for various reasons. As I've said before, every complaint that is filed with us receives a careful review, at least by one member of our intake team, and many also receive review or follow-up by a compliance agent or a manager within our division. We often will contact an agency with a request for more information about a complaint to give us additional information that might help our review. The agency's response either gives us needed context to be able to address that complaint, or it could prompt the division to conduct further action. We absolutely value hearing from members of the public, and any member of the public who is interested in filing a complaint with Post can contact us. The best and easiest way to submit a complaint is to do that online at the Commission's website, policecomplaints.mass.gov. Second, the division received 360 new complaints from law enforcement agencies during the same reporting period of March through July. This is a pretty consistent week-over-week rate to my last update in March. That number generally reflects the new internal affairs investigations that were opened by various agencies during that reporting period. And the division here, we're responsible for providing oversight of the agency IA process and the associated deadlines that agencies have to comply with. I would say we are diligent in fulfilling that responsibility. Every IA report is carefully reviewed. If there are potential grounds for follow-up by the Commission, that report by the agency could form the basis for us, the division, to request authorization to open a preliminary inquiry. Even in cases where a preliminary inquiry is not warranted, the information that we learn from these IA reports is often used by the Division of Police Certification to assess the character and fitness of officers when they apply for recertification. And so for those reasons, I just want to emphasize the importance of agencies complying with the IA deadlines and the procedures that are set forth in Chapter 6E of the General Laws and in 555 CMR 1. This next slide is a snapshot of our current caseload. So today, as you see, we have 108 active preliminary inquiries. That's a larger active caseload than we had when I last updated you in March. The number at that point was 101. But we've also finished 17 preliminary inquiries since March for a new total of 134 cases that have been moved forward to the public disciplinary process. The number of officers suspended by the commission has also grown from 73 in March to 90 today, and the same is true for the number of decertified individuals, which was 81 in March and 87 today. And finally, my last slide, I want to take a moment to focus on the length of time that it takes agencies to impose discipline once internal affairs charges have been sustained at the agency level. This is an area that the executive director has touched on in past meetings, and I wanted to follow up on it here. So under the current statute and regulations, there is no fixed number of days within which discipline must be imposed. It's unlike the other deadline periods that are fixed in statute for opening or reporting a complaint, for opening internal affairs, and for finalizing the internal affairs. Those aspects have dates fixed in statute and regulations. The length of time for discipline is not, but regardless, it is important that agencies promptly impose discipline once it has been determined that an officer is responsible for a violation of standards or agency policy. I also want to note this is often not just an agency's responsibility. It also requires the buy-in and participation from whatever entity the agency happens to belong to. So, for example, a city or local government, a hospital that has a police department within it, a sheriff's office, a college, a university, any entity that has a post-regulated law enforcement agency attached to it. A lot of times that agency or that entity has a significant responsibility in terms of making sure the disciplinary process moves promptly and swiftly. Now, we recognize that there's some delays are inevitable. Officers obviously are entitled to due process protections. Collective bargaining agreements provide protections that might warrant more time in some cases. None of those cases on the screen, I mean, there's a number of cases here on the screen, but they're not in violation of a date period. But we're presenting this information to emphasize the importance of moving this process along and not allowing cases to linger unnecessarily for extended periods of time. We recently presented the commission with the draft of proposed new regulations at 555 CMR 1.01. And one of the significant changes you'll recall that we proposed in that draft was to add a 60-day requirement for imposing discipline with the possibility of extensions for good cause. So we think that that approach, again, this is reiterating what we had said in the prior meeting, that approach would, I think, continue to allow for the legitimate time it takes to impose discipline, which could be longer than 60 days, but also allowing the commission greater oversight into this very important area of the process. So just to cover the numbers very quickly, you can see, obviously, Boston has 18 cases and we just took the agencies that have discipline that has been pending for longer than 60 days. So for the 34 cases on your screen, the average age of those is 212. You have one that's significant. The outlier there on the screen has been pending for a lot longer than that. This is a small number of cases compared to past reports. It's getting better, but that's still that's the picture as it is today. All right, so I'm happy to answer any questions, but I just want to say in closing, and as always, I want to recognize the hard work of the talented members of the Division of Standards team, and I want to thank them for their commitment to achieving the numbers behind the screen here. So with that said, I will stop sharing, and I can see that there's a question here. So,
Commissioner,
I have a,
Commissioner
I'm sorry.
Calderon, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Matt, thank you for the presentation. And it's a question in case I missed it somewhere. Have we moved any further as to implementation or some language on how to hold departments responsible when they fail to issue that discipline under the required timeframe?
Your question again about is it the length of what we're doing to hold the departments accountable? Well, I think the new draft that I just talked about is going to be the answer to that. So if we put a 60-day requirement into the regulations, but then allow extensions for good cause, and I think it's the oversight will there'll be a tool for oversight at that point, so that the commission can can at least evaluate reasons for needing additional time and address them sort of as they're happening rather than have to let them accumulate.
No, I know. More specifically, I guess what I'm trying to ask is what is the punishment and how do we enforce that? How do we make I work for Boston to be open for anybody that might be listening or looking. What do we do or what can we do to the Boston Police Department when they don't adhere to the policy?
Well, I mean, I see the executive director may want to comment too, but Enrique, do you want to go first, actually?
Let me mention this. And so we have been tossing around the idea of issuing notices of non-compliance. And if non-compliance with the regulations, which are in draft, carry a little bit more weight, there will be, they will not like to be called out by these notices, which we can post to the website. We can brief to you at regular meetings and ask them potentially to come explain themselves for a particular case. I should mention before I turn it over to Matt. Well, there's always the administrative suspension possibility but that applies only to failure to report to post. The particular case that we're talking about here may not necessarily fit. It's really just the notion that it takes a long time, longer than necessary. I will mention that some of the comments that we already received from mass chiefs in this particular area, they will claim or they will say that many times in these cases the chiefs themselves don't have either the authority to discipline because they don't hire or fire, they can only make recommendations, and that sometimes the arbitration process could be lengthy for whatever reason. Still, we think that putting a time frame and with the possibility for extensions, like Matt mentioned, will prompt or incentivize people to try to do these more timely. Matt, you want to expound on any of that?
Oh, that covers it. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I know it's something that I continually ask when we bring up this topic, but and I only speak for Boston, not for any of the other chiefs and other other departments. But in Boston, it's a real problem. And with cases that are 4 or 5 years old, we have officers that are waiting for years to close a case and find out what the discipline is. And it's really tough to have an officer waiting extended periods of time. And then all of a sudden, 4 years later, out of the blue, they're getting heavily disciplined or in some cases possibly threatened with termination. Departments need to be held responsible. There's a time frame that these should take place. And when there's a conclusion of a case and that discipline should be handed down. We shouldn't be holding cases open in a file drawer for extended periods of time in case we decide later there's a bad news story and then we decide we're going to discipline an officer. After that officer has effectively worked on the street for an extended period of time. I'll just give you an example that I find absolutely ridiculous. And again, in Boston, we had an officer that was involved in a use of force issue where an arrest was made. 10 years later, after that officer had worked for 10 years further on the street with a clean disciplinary record, the department wanted to issue suspension discipline prior to that officer retiring. Completely preposterous, completely out of line. And this organization should come up with some guidelines and some discipline that we can hold these departments responsible for their lack of follow through on disciplinary matters. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. If I may, there's 2 other possibilities for which we really will require regulations. One of them is around the agency certification process, which standards includes IA. Some of the so we could really look for type language around there around certifying agencies. And we internally have discussed the possibility of administrative penalties, monetary penalties, which would be, of course, the next level of after a notice of non-compliance. That would be the next level. For that, we will certainly need regulations and the ability to to get comments and have a process for appeal and etc. We, again, so on the pipeline to address, but we hear you loud and clear.
I appreciate it, Mr. Director. I'm a little spicy this morning on that topic as
It's an important topic. No, I mean,
Yeah,
we've seen instances in which they run out the clock and then an officer is out on leave, let's say, through the whole process, the investigation, etc. Then they need to come back to do a basic training altogether because the MPTC requirement kicks in of somebody being out for so long. And that becomes the real punishment, whether it's intended or not. I think it's not intended. It shouldn't be that, the purpose.
I appreciate your seriousness and the answer from you and Matt, and I apologize to my fellow commissioners since I'm probably going on too long, but we're holding individual officers throughout the Commonwealth responsible for their actions. The chiefs, excuse me, chiefs, not geared just toward you, but the chiefs of the departments or the department head themselves need to also be held accountable. There is absolutely no reason, it's completely unprofessional, to have a case that is at closure and they just leave it open without issuing discipline. And then that officer's out on the street, like I said, working for years with a clean record, and out of the blue, they being the department, think it's okay to finally hand down discipline for one reason or another. There needs to be a time frame and there needs to be some punishment or someone held accountable for the fact that they don't do what this organization is setting for regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Luma, please.
Thank you. The agency that hasn't handed out discipline in about approximately 2 years, are there extenuating circumstances around that? And also, what is our current internal process as far as how often are we requesting the status or the outcome of a disciplinary investigation? I just want to know, like, are we asking monthly, every several weeks? Like, how often are we requesting this information from the agencies?
The answer to the first question about the outlier case, there are some extenuating circumstances, in part. As to your second question, I'm sorry, can I just ask you to say it again?
Yeah, I'm just wondering the frequency of when we're requesting this information from the departments. Is it just coming up for review every couple of months? Like what's our internal process as far as requesting this information to kind of hold them accountable in that way?
Thank you. We run reports internally pretty regularly, I would say every couple of months or so. And then our intake team is reaching out to the agencies and asking, we're putting internal tasks in our system to follow up with the agency on a every other month basis and asking them what they're doing and why and what the reason for the delay is, how much more time is needed.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Commissioner Talley, please.
Thank you. Well, one, I agree with my colleague, Commissioner Calderon, in that if a line isn't drawn, then there is no line. And if there aren't repercussions, then what's the motivation to address some of these outstanding issues or discipline? So my question to Matt is, in the last time I saw this report, I don't recall what the exact number is. Boston was lagging as they are today. So has there been measurable progress between the last time you gave this report and today with Boston?
I think so. I think the number is lower than it was the last time. I don't remember exactly when Enrique last presented this number, but it's lower today than it was then. So there's been work done. Work remains to be done, but there's been work done.
Okay, thank you.
And Commissioner Crispin, please.
Yes, just wanted to point out, I think the main issue related to these outstanding cases and the case that Larry talked about, not to speak about specifics, is that an officer will then end up with 3-4 cases stacked over maybe 3 to 4 years, whereas if discipline had been imposed, that issue could have been addressed. And then the department all of a sudden moves to either do what they call a last chance agreement. So if you have one more mess up, you're going to get terminated, or they move to impose really harsh discipline. And a lot of these issues sometimes are easily addressed at the forefront if they just said, okay, we're going to impose discipline and some additional training as it relates to this issue. So I think for a lot of officers, it's problematic because they know they have this case, or sometimes it's been forgotten, right? If 10 years later, you've forgotten what you did. Sometimes people don't remember what they did a year before. And then you're faced with another situation, which may be inconsequential in nature, but then they stack these cases and all of a sudden you're looking at some very heavy-handed discipline.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from commissioners? If not, I certainly echo Matt's comments about thanking the staff for all the hard work that they've engaged in since his earlier report. We are very grateful for that. Moving on now to the legal update. Let me turn to our general counsel. Please, Randy.
Thank you very much. I will aim to share my screen. Okay, are you able to see the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you. This is a presentation on a draft set of regulations that was initially presented to the commission at its June public meeting. And at that time, it was entitled Law Enforcement Agencies, Officers, and Functions Subject to Regulation. The title has now been made more condensed, and the term functions has been replaced with conduct. So it now refers to regulated agencies, officers, and conduct. Just to provide an overview by way of reminder and for members of the public who may not have seen the June Public Commission meeting, these proposed regulations would help explain who is governed by Chapter 6E of the general laws and thus subject to commission jurisdiction. And they would codify interpretations and rules that have been previously recognized by the commission and give all of those the force of law. And just to provide an overview of the process so far, these proposed regulations, as I said, incorporate a series of definitions and policies that were adopted by the commission between 2022 and 2025, as well as others that were proposed but not formally adopted in 2025 and 2026. And there have been opportunities for public comment as to all of those prior policies. The regulations were then presented, as I said, at the commission's June public meeting. And at that time, the commission's personnel sought feedback from inside and outside the commission. And then thereafter, we posted a notice inviting comments on the regulations on the commission's website. And we reached out to certain affected stakeholders who have expressed interests in this area. And then revisions were made based on feedback that we received from inside and outside the commission. So now we are coming back with a presentation, and this presentation focuses on the most significant changes that were made to the June version of the regulations. There are some other smaller refinements that were made in the interest of making things clearer or making things more concise where no substantive change was intended. And so I won't focus on those in this presentation, but the commissioner's meeting packet includes a copy of the latest version of the regulations with explanatory comments, as well as the last version of the regulations that can be used for comparison. And today we're planning to ask the commissioners to initially approve these proposed regulations and thus begin the promulgation process. And as the commission well knows, that process would provide plenty of opportunity for public comment. There would be hearing, there would be sufficient time for members of the public to submit comments. And we in the past have always taken into account public comments, and we've always made changes based on the comments that we've received. And if the commission does not vote to approve these regulations today, but it doesn't reject them entirely, and it votes to consider them at a future meeting, there would still be opportunities for public comment between now and that future meeting. But if they are approved, certain small refinements to other regulations would be needed in order to harmonize the provisions of all the regulations, and we would identify those for the commission when it comes time to approach the formal final promulgation stage. Now, to to go over the changes that have been made since the June meeting, and again, these are the significant changes. In section 301, which concerns the scope of the regulations, it now makes clear that if any prior commission policies are inconsistent with these regulations, the regulations would supersede them going forward, but not with respect to any past occurrence or past status. And it now expressly affirms that these regulations do not affect any regulation, policy, or action of the Municipal Police Training Committee. Those things are governed by their own regulations and their own policies and actions. The next section concerning definitions now includes a refined definition of arrest that provides some further elaboration from the same body of case law that the definition was drawn from previously. And it omits any reference to what is not an arrest. Previously, there was a reference to the mere service of papers being not an arrest. That's still something that is consistent with the definition, but because of the additional elaboration that's been provided, it didn't seem necessary to list things that are not included in the definition. Then the definition of a member of a law enforcement agency would include some additional people, those who are appointed candidates or sponsored candidates as those terms are defined in the MPTC's regulations. And so in those regulations, it states that an appointed candidate is someone who a law enforcement agency has hired to become a law enforcement officer and who needs to be enrolled in a police academy. And a sponsored candidate is someone a law enforcement agency sponsors but is not hired to become a law enforcement officer and who needs to be enrolled in a police academy. So in other words, these are student officers, they are cadets in academies who have a very close affiliation with a law enforcement agency, so much so that the MPTC's regulations also provide that those student officers are subject to the policies, procedures, and rules and regulations of their appointing or sponsoring agency. So it seemed fitting to treat them as a member of the law enforcement agency for purposes of these regulations. Then the next set of sections deals with law enforcement agencies, officers, heads of agencies, and a section that is now entitled Commission Status Determinations. And so this part of the regulations now makes clear that hospitals, and really hospital police departments that are covered by Chapter 6E and Commission regulations, are those that are licensed by the Department of Public Health pursuant to statute, and that's because the definition of law enforcement officer in Chapter 6E refers to special state police officers who are appointed under another particular statute, and that statute refers to hospitals that are licensed by the Department of Public Health. And then as to the indication in Chapter 6E that a sheriff's office is a law enforcement agency in its performance of police duties and functions, it includes that qualifying language. The regulations now draw lines a little bit differently than they did in the past draft. So in the past draft, it said that those parts of a sheriff's office that are devoted to police duties and functions are in scope and others are out of scope. Now it would refer to those members and resources of the office. So it provides a little bit more elaboration, a little bit more precision that we're talking about the people and the resources of the office. And then instead of saying that those who perform arrests and most other police duties and functions are in scope, it would now say those performing substantial police duties and functions are in scope. And it would call for a sheriff's office to provide some more detail as to any claim it makes that a member does not perform police duties and functions. This part of the regulations would now also make expressly clear that the list of factors that would weigh in favor of a determination that one is in fact a law enforcement officer would also apply to a determination that one is in fact a law enforcement agency head. And that was consistent with the original intent. It just makes it more expressly clear. And a couple things were added to the list: displaying an insignia of rank and working in an agency's headquarters, station, barracks, or facility. Those are things that would tend to point in the direction of somebody being a law enforcement agency officer or head. Then there's a new section that affirms that unless the commission determines otherwise, someone in a sheriff's office who is found to be a law enforcement officer would remain so during the length of time that they work for that office at all times. So not only at the moment when they're performing police duties and functions, and it's not something that ends at some point in time, unless the commission so decides. They would have that status while they're working for that office. Similarly, while the statute provides that a constable who executes an arrest is a law enforcement officer, once somebody is determined to be a law enforcement officer by virtue of executing an arrest, they would continue to hold that status while they're serving the same jurisdiction. It wouldn't change from one day to the next. Then any other determinations that may need to be made over time regarding the status of particular entities or individuals, because every now and then we hear about a unit of government or an individual that is not as common as a municipal police department or a municipal police officer, and where there's a question about whether that entity or that person is in fact within the scope of Chapter 6E and Commission regulations. And so this set of regulations does not attempt to itemize every entity or every individual in Massachusetts that might fall in that category where questions could be raised, and particularly because lots of times there are differences from one city to another, one agency to another. And so this set of regulations would allow those determinations to be made on a case-by-case basis, applying the criteria that are set forth in the regulations, and then we can publicly post those determinations. The next set of sections deal with law enforcement powers and police duties and functions, and they were reframed just to make them more clear and concise, hopefully. No substantive change was intended, but I will point out that in the list of police duties and functions, it concludes with "and," so suggesting that that all of those things need to be performed, but it really should be changed to "or." In other words, each one of those things is a police duty and function. Then Section 309 is new. It's been added since June, and it affirms that the Commission can exercise jurisdiction with respect to matters contemplated by Chapter 6E or Title 555 of the CMR as to law enforcement agencies, law enforcement officers, and those who are certified, and also those who oversee or who work for or who are cadets appointed or sponsored by such agencies, as well as those who are in the process of undergoing training that was ordered by the Commission, or those who are testifying in a Commission proceeding or are subject to a subpoena from the Commission or an information demand from the Commission, as well as those who are violating the anti-retaliation provision contained in the Commission's governing statute, and others who don't have one of those statuses now, but based on conduct that they undertook when they fell within one of those categories. And I just want to note that qualifying language above with respect to matters contemplated by 6E or 555. So in other words, the regulations do not purport to assert jurisdiction over all these people with respect to anything they may do that may or may not have any relationship to the post-commission and its statute and regulations. It's limited to things that are contemplated by the statute and regulations. And the Commission could do so, the regulation states, based on conduct and events that occur prior to or since the enactment of Chapter 6E, while an individual is on duty or off duty, or within or outside Massachusetts. And all of those things are consistent with implications in Chapter 6E and the 2020 session law that adopted it, as well as Commission regulations and public guidance, in other words, things that the Commission has already adopted, as well as decisions made by our agency in individual cases, and judicial decisions regarding the Commission itself or comparable matters. Then the regulations conclude with sections 310 and 311, and section 310 now elaborates more on certain alternative legal theories or legal tests for holding an agency accountable for the conduct of an employee. In other words, different parts of the law have different tests for when an agency can be held accountable for its employees' conduct. When we're talking about liability, of course, these regulations do not concern liability. They concern the regulation, the oversight of agencies. But this section now draws in greater detail from the different tests that are available in the law for making those determinations of when an agency should be held responsible for conduct by one of its employees. And beyond that, they just make some refinements to the language to make things more clear, but without intending any substantive changes. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I can entertain any questions if the chair would like me to do so. See, Commissioner Calderoni has raised his hand.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I guess my first request would be, is it possible to have this sent out to us with the red line version of all changes completely with the language to more easily be comparable for the commissioners? I know some of the comments and some of the pieces here where they were refined and they were made easier for us, but I like to do my due diligence specifically, and I want to be able to report back to the other organizations that I represent and be clear in what language was actually changed. Every word has meaning in law, as we all understand. So I'm not prepared to vote on this. I think we need a side-by-side red line on it. I have some questions. I don't know if I can do one by one with you, if that'd be okay.
Sure. As to both things, we can certainly do that. I will tell you, I made the call not to include the red line version only because it ended up looking so sloppy that I thought it wouldn't be helpful to the commissioners, and I thought it might be more helpful to do things this way. But I could certainly provide that, and then as far as any other particular points, we're always happy to discuss things.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I know sometimes it can be tedious to have the red line. It's easier for a quick synopsis of changes, but I would like to do it in a red line version. For me specifically, it makes it easier.
Well, and then before I turn to Commissioner Crispin, Randy, as to Commissioner Calderon's request that we hold off on voting, what's your view on that?
Well, I certainly respect whatever the commission would decide to do. As I've said, my view of these is that they largely capture things that have been discussed and that the commission has voted on previously. So we were hoping to get a vote and then begin the promulgation process, which would allow for further changes to be made over time before they become finalized. But I certainly, respect whatever the commission chooses to do.
Madam Chair, if I could continue for 1 second. I think it's important, and I understand exactly that we voted on them in the past, and some of these appeared to me immediately to be minor changes. However, I don't think that expediting or rushing through a promulgation at this point to proceed is appropriate, which is why I'm hoping to hold off at least till next month till we get the red line version to compare side by side. I have some questions about specifically changes in the language to arrest, and that's only the first one as part of the definition. So I would rather be thorough before I take a vote. I'm sure I don't need a motion to table it because I'm sure my other commissioners who I see have their hands up probably have something that they're going to speak of. But I'm hoping that we would wait till at least next month till we have the red line version. Okay. Sorry, Chair, go ahead.
No, may the record reflect that Commissioner Calderon began his very useful comments with, he wanted 1 second. Remember that?
I will move on, Madam Chair. No problem at all. No problem.
But we are mindful, all the commissioners are mindful of the substance of what you're requesting. And let me turn to the others who have their hands up. And Commissioner Crispin, I think you were next, please.
Just wanted briefly, I know we've spoken at length around this issue of constables. I know it seems like they're trying to put some parameters around that. I think the one piece that's lacking, there's nothing specifically in the statute or in the Commonwealth that I'm aware of that speaks to training. I know in the past I was a constable, it was just a process. Once you got sworn in, there was no training. So again, if we're going to put some parameters, and I think we need to ensure that there is some kind of training for those who are going to become constables so that they are in alignment with the law and the mandates of what post is asking.
Thank you. Commissioner Baker, please.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that was said, and I would like to make a motion just for that, just to have more time to go through the actual changes and spend some time with this document other than the limited time we have. So I would make that motion that we get the red line of the changes that were made to the draft and table this for now until we can go through
Okay.
more thoroughly.
Commissioner Baker, I don't think we need a motion on that. Does any commissioner object to holding off and waiting? I just don't think that we need the motion on that, although I appreciate your offering it. So I think with that, Randy, we will hold off. You will redline, provide that to the commissioners, and we will address this at the next meeting, our September meeting. Okay? Anything else any of the commissioners want to say with regard to this? Randy, let me thank you and others on your staff who have worked so hard and carefully on this particular issue. I know we all appreciate that. Thank you. And I think with that, we can move on to item number 5B on our agenda, which is an act promoting rule of law, oversight, trust, and equal constitutional treatment, the so-called PROTECT Act. And who's going to be handling this, Randy?
That'll be Attorney Kimberly Shatford.
Attorney Shatford, then please.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I will start by sharing my screen. All right. So I'll be speaking about the PROTECT Act, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Counsel Annie Lee, with special thanks to legal intern Brian Park for his research in this area. There we go. So by way of background, this act largely came as a response to the Trump administration's practices in regards to immigration enforcement, and in particular, the administration's choice to depart from longstanding federal policy that prevented civil immigration detainments or arrests at sensitive locations, such as childcare centers, healthcare facilities, schools, and courthouses, unless there was an underpinning judicial order or warrant. So for history for this act in particular, the concept was proposed back in 2026 in January by the governor when she issued an executive order and related guidelines for immigration matters. And later that same month, the initial legislation was filed by the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus. And in subsequent weeks, both chambers of the legislature approved their own versions of the bill before a compromise version was approved and then signed into law by the governor earlier this month. There are four main goals of the act: to foster trust between residents and their communities, to protect residents from discrimination, to limit state and municipal participation in immigration enforcement while still preserving officers' authority to investigate and prosecute crime, and also to uphold the rule of law. I will briefly go over some of the highlights of this act, though I'll note they generally fall into three main categories: conduct that is prohibited, protections that are strengthened, and safeguards that have been put in place. Turning first to prohibitions, the act prohibits officers from conducting or participating in federal civil immigration enforcement, and it also prohibits officers at the state and local level from providing certain information to federal immigration authorities. Namely, they're not to provide non-public personal information, a custody status of a person, advance notice of a person's upcoming court appearances, and advance notice of a person's release, though I will note that for those last two categories, there are some limited circumstances where that information may be provided. The Act also bars the use of state and local resources for federal civil immigration enforcement and prohibits officers from stopping, questioning, or targeting someone based solely on their immigration or citizenship status, though there is an exception if their status is directly material to a specific criminal offense, then an officer may ask about their status. And lastly, in terms of prohibition, the Act prohibits new, renewed, or expanded 287G agreements, which are essentially agreements that deputize local and state officers to act with the powers generally accorded to ICE agents. And there are two, I would say, main carve-outs for this prohibition. The first being that it does not impact the Massachusetts Department of Corrections existing agreement, and the second being that in very narrow circumstances that are criminal law-focused arrangements, new agreements can be entered into, though I will note that there would be several safeguards that would have to be observed, such as they can only last initially for a 12-month period. And that covers the prohibition. So moving on to protections that the Act strengthens, it enhances protections at sensitive locations, meaning that civil immigration enforcement actions such as arrest cannot happen at locations that are sensitive, and should the governor call for it, civil immigration enforcement actions will either be prohibited or at least limited at non-public areas of state entities. The Act also establishes protections for individuals housed in state and local detention facilities. Namely, these facilities will be required to provide notice of detained individuals' rights in writing, and they would also be it would also be necessary for them to provide access or the means to access court proceedings, and also the means for individuals to engage in confidential attorney-client communications. And then finally, in this area, the Act will mandate that there is a public-facing system for locating detained individuals in these detention facilities. And the Act also preserves officers' authority to investigate and prosecute crimes, meaning that state and local officers will still be able to conduct their investigations, share information, and partner with federal authorities on criminal matters, provided they do not divulge into civil immigration enforcement arena, and of course officers can still comply with judicial warrants and orders. Also, in terms of protections that are strengthened, the Act expands bases for certifying applications for non-immigrant UNT visas, and I know UNT visas were the subject of an earlier presentation at an earlier commission meeting. It also expands Section 1983 type liability to federal officers and calls on the governor to publish multilingual guidelines to stakeholders like public agencies, state agencies, I should say, private entities, law enforcement agencies, and the public that relate to interactions with civil immigration enforcement officers, namely how to handle such interactions, and also guidelines that explain civil rights related to immigration enforcement. And the Act would also expand bail eligibility considerations to include a final order of removal. And then finally, for the highlights, I will briefly go over the new safeguards that are being put in place. First being that the Act allows parents to establish prearranged guardianship plans for their children in the event that the parent is detained, deported, or denied entry to the U.S. And it will also require employers to provide written notice of federal immigration inspections. Generally, they will be required to provide notice within 48 hours of being told such an inspection will take place. A new commission will also be created on immigration matters in the Commonwealth that will be charged with investigating and making recommendations related to immigration matters in Massachusetts. And finally, the Act empowers the state auditor to review 287G agreements and audit immigration detention facilities. So what does this mean for POST? There are many things it does not do. It does not amend Post Enabling Statute, Chapter 6E. It does not require the Commission to take on any additional responsibilities, and it does not prevent the Commission from continuing with its current responsibilities. Where it does impact the Commission is that the Commission will be affected to the extent all state agencies are impacted, and to the extent the state and local law enforcement obligations and responsibilities are affected, the Commission will be impacted as an oversight body. So turning first to the implications for POST as a state agency, the Commission will not be allowed to use its resources for federal civil immigration enforcement. And should the governor prohibit it, civil immigration enforcement actions will not be allowed to occur on non-public areas of the Commission's premises. The Commission may also receive guidelines from the Governor related to this area of civil immigration enforcement, and should the Commission receive notice of a federal immigration inspection, it will be required to provide notice to its employees within the time frame specified in the Act. Finally, turning to implications for Post as an oversight agency, there are some areas that will be impacted, namely in the realm of agency certification standards. Post will want to make sure it is in harmony with the Act. This will most notably happen for the standard regarding officer response procedures. It'll want to make sure that it is incorporating into sub-policy or sub-provision aspects of the Act that reform UNT visas. So that will be accounted for in its agency certification standards. And then finally, in terms of the Commission's investigatory and disciplinary powers, given that the Act does prohibit officers from engaging in certain conduct, it is entirely possible that the Commission will receive complaints that officers have engaged in such conduct. And if that occurs, the Commission can investigate and may conduct a preliminary inquiry or advance to an adjudicatory proceeding if necessary. And that does bring me to the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Attorney Shatford, for that very thorough analysis. Any questions or comments from my fellow commissioners? I think you said, Kimberly, when this is effective. Can you just repeat that?
Yes, it was signed into law August 5th, and it will go into effect September 4th.
Thank you. I think I don't see any questions or comments. So once more, thanks very much to you for your analysis and your presentation today. We very much appreciate that. Moving on now to item number 6, there is a matter which was not anticipated by me at the time of posting, and at this point I turn to Commissioner Bluestone.
Thank you, Chair Hinkle. I would just like to take a moment to express my condolences to the family, fellow officers and friends of Officer Kurt Solomon, who died this past week. Officer Solomon was a highly regarded and dependable patrolman. He was an Army veteran and a 31-year veteran of the Worcester Police Department, who served on the bike unit for community policing in Worcester. I would also like to acknowledge his wife, Karen Solomon. She was and is, as far as we know, an advocate of first responder mental health, who has also been the co-founder of First Help, which is an organization that supports families of officers who have died by suicide. This is obviously a deeply sad event for our local Worcester community. And I hope that if anything positive can come from this very tragic event, that it will help to serve as a catalyst for destigmatizing mental health issues and our work to increase access to mental health services. And I'm very sad about this outcome and wish everyone the best.
Thank you. Commissioner Calderon?
Just want to say thank you, Hanya. Much appreciated for everybody. Thank you.
I think we share that. Thank you very much, Commissioner Bluestone. And with that, I would entertain a motion, commissioners, to go into executive session in accordance with General Laws, Chapter 38, Section 21A1, to discuss the discipline or the dismissal of or complaints or charges brought against a public employee, officer, or individuals. The same statute, Section 21A5, to discuss the investigation of charges of criminal misconduct. Section 21A7 of the statute combined with Section 6E, Chapter 6A rather, Section 8C2, and to the extent that they may be applicable, General Laws, Chapter 6, Sections 168 and 178, to discuss matters relating to preliminary inquiries and initial staff review concerning whether to initiate such inquiries and regarding certain criminal record information, and Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, combined with Chapter 30A, Sections 22F and G, to discuss and to approve prior executive session minutes. We will be addressing Division of Standards reports of preliminary inquiries in 3 cases. The division's request to enter voluntary decertification, suspension, or disposition agreement in 3 cases. Standards request of approval to impose or revoke a suspension in 2 cases. And standards request for approval to conduct preliminary inquiries in 3 cases. In addition, we will be addressing approval of the minutes of the executive session of last month, July 16th, 2026. Is there a motion to go into executive session?
I'll make the motion, yes.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
So let's take a vote on that, please. I think Commissioner Baker seconded it, so I'll start. Commissioner Bluestone, do you approve?
Yes.
Commissioner Crispin?
Yes.
Commissioner Hall?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarosian?
Yes.
Commissioner Luma?
Yes.
And Commissioner Talley?
Yes.
Thank you. I also approve. So that's unanimously carried. Members of the public, we appreciate your participating in our meeting. We will not be returning to the public meeting after the executive session. Enrique, would you like to again tell the public how, if they wish to comment on anything we've addressed, they can reach out to us?
Yes, email at posty-comments@mass.gov. Visit our website, mapostcommission.gov, or our number 617-701-8401.
And let me, on behalf of the commissioners, thank the members of your staff and you, Enrique, for all of the hard work that you put into the matters that we've addressed today. We greatly appreciate that. And with that, we'll take approximately a 5-minute recess, commissioners, before we go into executive session. Jamie, you provided us with, again, with the information as to how to access the executive session.
Yes, Penny just sent it a few minutes ago.
Thank you very much. Okay. So we'll leave the public meeting now.
Thank you.